All right, turn to 1 Samuel chapter 13. I'm going to review a little bit of our last couple of messages from the book of 1 Samuel. It's been a little while since we've been there. We've had Pastor Josh preach for us, and then Pastor Towns preached for us on Sunday nights, and so I haven't been back in the book in a little while, but I'm excited to get back into this study of the book. Now, a few messages ago, we looked at Samuel's final address, found in chapter number 12, and basically he addressed the nation for the last time as the judge before the king came in, and he states his testimony, how it was above reproach, how he had lived his life and judged the nation of Israel righteously. And he pointed out how God had dealt with Israel, how God had dealt with Israel throughout their history, how God had dealt with them righteously, and pointing really to the fact that everything good that had happened in Israel's history had been a result of God working. He was also reminding them of that important fact as they went into this next stage as a nation, reminding them that God had worked, God had done all of this. And he reminded them as well that having a king was their choice, not God's. He said, you made this choice. This wasn't something God did. It was something that they had wanted. God was not ready to give them a king yet at this point. And yet God said, you know what? This is what you've wished for. I'm going to give it to you. And then he gives them God's conditions, which was basically, you know what? You need to follow God. If you follow him, you'll continue to follow him. If you stray from him, there will be judgment that comes. At the end of chapter 12, Samuel gives his final words, his final challenge. And on Anniversary Sunday, we really looked in great detail at verse 24 and looked at that as what we need to do as we want to go forward and where we go from here. And that brings us to chapter 13. We're going to look at the whole chapter. How many of you read it this afternoon? Okay, that's all right. I said go home and read it, but nobody wanted to work ahead. That's okay. It'll all be a surprise to you tonight. That's good. Okay? But we're going to look at the entirety of the chapter tonight. So let's pray. All right, Lord, thank you for this day. And Lord, for a great day you've given us in your house. It's been different, but Lord, it's been a good day to be together. Lord, I pray, Lord, that you would be with the service tonight, Lord. I pray you'd be with my voice, that you would just help it to stay strong through the message, Lord. We pray again for Pastor, that you would just continue to be with him and strengthen him. And Lord, I just pray that you would help us to focus on your word tonight and what you have for us. And I pray you bless this time together, Lord, in Jesus' name. Amen. So on June 6th, 1944, I've always told you I like history. So does anybody know what happened on that day? That's D-Day, okay? That's what we would call D-Day. It marked, though, the beginning of the end of World War II. We know it as D-Day, that during that day, 5,000 ships and landing craft were used to land 150,000 troops on the beaches of Normandy. Now, this picture is after the landing happened, but that's the ships all coming in. But they had ships farther out, and they sent in their landing ships, and 150,000 men landed on the different beaches of Normandy. There were also paratroopers who were dropped in beforehand to help prepare the way for those landing on the beach. I read a really cool book about these gliders that went in, these wooden gliders that went in behind, and they captured a bridge that allowed, they were able to block off reinforcements coming, all these different things that went into place for D-Day to happen. And then there were the troops that landed on the beaches. This is probably a famous picture or one similar to it, except it's not going to pop up for me. All right. But we have these different pictures of the men landing on the beaches. They faced really machine gun fire from fortified positions. They had to storm those beaches. And during that attack, 4,414 men died. Now that day and the days and the months to follow, they were filled with fighting, casualties, but just under a year later, Germany surrendered to the Allied forces. And that day, June 6, 1944, really was the beginning of the end for the German war machine and what they were trying to accomplish. I don't know if you've ever had a time where you knew that it was the beginning of the end. Okay? Maybe it was a job and you're like, oh, I can feel it. I know it's happening. Or maybe it was a relationship that you just knew, okay, that event is the beginning of the end of this relationship. Maybe it was a car starting to go out on you. Pastor Josh, okay? I've had that, right? You have a car and something goes wrong and you're like, oh man, this is the start of just never ending and it's the beginning of the end. You knew it was happening and there was really nothing that you could do to stop it. And that's what we find in chapter 13 of 1 Samuel. It's the beginning of the end of Saul's reign and really the beginning of God's plan then to install David as the next king. So look at verse 1 of chapter 13. It says, Saul reigned 1 year, and when he had reigned 2 years over Israel, Saul chose him 3,000 men of Israel, whereof 2,000 were with Saul in Michmash and in Mount Bethel, and 1,000 were with Jonathan in Gibeah of Benjamin, and the rest of the people he sent every man to his tent. So this chapter picks up after Saul has reigned. It says for 2 years. So the first year didn't really have anything happen. It just tells us Saul reigned 1 year. Okay? But it really didn't take Saul long to mess up, did it? In this second year of his reign, he decides he needs to get himself an army of sorts. We're not sure why he did this, but he chooses 3,000 men from Israel. He keeps 2,000 and he sends 1,000 with Jonathan. And really those two verses just set the stage for the first event in this chapter, the first event in this account, which is Jonathan's victory. Verse 3, and Jonathan smote the garrison of the Philistines that was in Geba. And the Philistines heard of it. So if we go backwards a little bit in the book of 1 Samuel, we see the nation of Israel was really just under occupation of the Philistines. In chapter 10, we're told that there was a garrison of the Philistines in the hill of God. We just read here in chapter 13, there's a garrison of the Philistines in Geba. In chapter 9, Samuel is told that the man God is sending out of Benjamin is going to be, yes, the first king, but also that he was going to save my people out of the hand of the Philistines. So the nation of Israel is not in a good spot. Okay, in chapter 8, when they asked for a king, they told Samuel, we want somebody who is going to go out before us and fight our battles. In chapter 11, we saw the Ammonites came against Jabesh Gilead, and God uses Saul to deliver the people. So the nation was oppressed. They were not free. They were under control. And as we continue in 1 Samuel, we're going to see they weren't really strong militarily either. Saul has gathered only 3,000 men together. And I don't know if this was all he could get. Maybe it was all that they could afford as a nation to keep and to feed. Back in chapter 11, we're told 330,000 men go to battle. But this is a little different. This isn't God. Well, really in chapter 11, Saul sent out, I'm trying to remember now off the top of my head, I think he sent out a heifer and he said, come, join us. And he gives this big speech and they come out and they gather together to fight against these men in Jabesh Gilead. But this is different. This is Saul sort of recruiting himself an army. And he really hasn't done anything as a king up until this point. It almost feels like he's wanting to feel more like a king, right? He's only been king for 2 years. I need an army. I need to have these men around me. But he doesn't want to lead them as a king should. And Jonathan, though, he decides that he needs to attack this garrison in Geba. And all that we're told is that he smites the garrison. He was able to defeat them with 1,000 men, most likely. Then it means this garrison was small. But really, Jonathan is winning the real first victory in the era of the kings against this occupying force of the Philistines. Turn back to chapter 10, though, with me, all right? In chapter 10, Samuel specifically mentions this garrison to Saul. Verse number 5 of chapter 10. After that, okay, so Saul has met Samuel. Samuel has said, this is what you're going to do. He's anointed him. He says, you're going to go and you're going to see all these things. These signs are going to happen. And he says, and after that thou shalt come to the hill of God, where is the garrison of the Philistines? And it shall come to pass, when thou art come hither to the city, that thou shalt meet a company of prophets coming down from the high place with a psaltery and a tabret and a pipe, and a harp before them, and they shall prophesy. And the Spirit of the Lord will come upon thee, and thou shalt prophesy with them, and shalt be turned into another man. And let it be, when these signs are come unto thee, that thou do as occasion serve thee, for God is with thee. And thou shalt go down before me to Gilgal, and behold, I will come down unto thee to offer burnt offerings, and to sacrifice sacrifices of peace offerings. 7 days shalt thou tarry till I come to thee, and show thee what thou shalt do. In looking at these verses, it seems to be some indication that Saul had been told by Samuel to attack this garrison. Long before Jonathan made the attack, there's really no reason for the garrison to be mentioned here in chapter 10. And in verse 7, Saul has said that thou shalt do as occasion serve thee. You could alternately translate that as do thee as thy hand shall find. Basically, it's sort of this implicit command. You're going to see this garrison. All these things are going to come to pass. God is going to be with you. Go do what your hand shall find to do. So there seems to be some indication that Saul had already been told to attack this garrison. And then to wait for Samuel at Gibeah is the next instruction, to wait for 7 days. But after chapter 10, we don't have any record of that. We don't have a record of anything with this garrison. We don't have a record of Saul going to Gibeah and waiting for 7 days. So it's entirely possible, as we look at chapter 10, that Saul did not obey Samuel in chapter number 10. And now we see his son doing what he was supposed to have done previously. And we're going to see in just a minute, Saul is back, and he's all of a sudden later on in chapter 13, he's in Gibeah waiting for 7 days. Okay, so that's why we draw that connection there. So Jonathan wins this great victory, and then next thing in this account is Saul's deception. And I think this is the part where we start to see Saul's true character come out. Okay, up until this point, he has been he's been sort of humble. Okay, if you look in chapter 11, after he wins this great victory, and the people say, who are the guys who are saying Saul shouldn't be king? Let's kill them. Right? He says, no, we're not going to kill these men. When Samuel was going to present him to the nation, he was hiding himself. So I believe there was a little bit of humility in Saul, but mainly I think it was driven by fear and insecurity on his part. Now, by the time we get to chapter 13, he's now come to the rescue of Jabesh Gilead. He's led an army of 330,000 men to do so. He's built up this small army for himself, and now he's no longer humble, but is instead beginning to be filled with the pride of the position he's in. And I believe that Saul becoming prideful in his position, in his power, is what started the beginning of the end for him. All right, we know these verses, but Proverbs 16:18 tells us that pride goeth before destruction, and an haughty spirit before a fall. Saul got lifted up and decided, I'm not going to obey God in these things. I don't need to obey God in these things. In 1 Timothy chapter 3, we're given the requirements for a pastor. And we're told that he should not be not a novice, lest being lifted up with pride, he fall into the condemnation of the devil. There's warnings for people who are in leadership positions to not be lifted up in pride, because when you do that, it's very easy and very soon you will fall. So oftentimes when power or money is brought into play, then the true nature of a person comes out. There's a saying I've heard about money, and I believe it applies really in a lot of areas of life, but it's money as a magnifier. It makes you more of who you already are. Okay, we can change the word money and replace it with influence or power or leadership or anything else you want to put there. More of something does not change who we fundamentally are. Right? You might have this thinking, well, if I had more power at my workplace, if I was in charge, I could do a lot of good. Okay, but if you complain all the time, or you cheat your employer by not working when you're there at work, or you mistreat the employees who are under you, guess what's going to be magnified when you're in charge? All of that. Okay? And I believe Saul was fearful, and he was insecure about being this leader. He had gotten a little bit of pride because he had beaten the Ammonites. He's now the king. And when Jonathan wins this initial victory, then his fear and his insecurity, though, were magnified. So look at verse 3 and 4. It says, And Jonathan smote the garrison of the Philistines that was in Gibeah, and the Philistines heard of it. And Saul blew the trumpet throughout all the land, saying, Let the Hebrews hear. And all Israel heard say that Saul had smitten a garrison of the Philistines, and that Israel also had an abomination with the Philistines. And the people were called together after Saul to Gilgal. Okay, so he says, instead of saying, look at what Jonathan has done, or instead of pointing to God as the one having won the victory through Jonathan, instead he says, no, I've smitten this garrison. He blows the trumpet. He announces to the entire nation that he is the one who won the victory. And in these verses, we're told the Philistines heard of the defeat of the garrison at Gibeah. And then we are told in verse 4 that Israel also had an abomination with the Philistines. So I don't know. I have actually my old Bible and my new Bible now. I have the translator's notes in my Bible. And so when you look at Gibeah, there's the hill. So when we look back at chapter 10, and there's the garrison of the Philistines and the hill of God. Okay. But then here in verse number 4, it basically says it could be that it says that they stank. So this had an abomination with the Philistines. They stank before the Philistines. Basically, this had put the nation of Israel on the bad side of the Philistines. All right, they were occupying. Now they'd had this attack happen, and now every Israelite was looked down upon by the Philistines, and they stunk in their eyes. And so the next thing we see in this passage as we walk through it is Israel's fear. Look at verse 5. And the Philistines gathered themselves together to fight with Israel. 30,000 chariots and 6,000 horsemen, and people as the sand which is on the seashore in multitude. And they came up and pitched in Michmash eastward from Bethaven. When the men of Israel saw that they were in a strait, for the people were distressed, then the people did hide themselves in caves and in thickets and in rocks, and in high places and in pits. And some of the Hebrews went over Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. As for Saul, he was yet in Gilgal, and all the people followed him, trembling. So there's not much to look at here other than the Philistines got angry and they gathered their armies together. Saul had been in Michmash earlier. Word had gotten back to the Philistines, right, that Saul was the one who had done this. They heard about this. And so they send their armies to Michmash. And at the end of verse 4, Saul and the people are now in Gilgal. And I had a map I was going to put up, and I didn't get it in there. But there's a bit of a distance there between those two. And it almost seems like Saul is now trying to rebuild this army. He wants more than the 3,000. Because it's really overwhelming odds that they're facing. Because we're told the people that the Philistines had were as the sand which is on the seashore in multitude. So the word came to those who were gathered with Saul, and we see them really no longer trusting in the king that they had chosen. But many of them desert the king. They flee. Some hide themselves. Some even cross over the Jordan River away from the amassing army of the Philistines. And Saul stays in Gilgal, but we're told that the people who stayed with him followed him trembling. And while he's in Gilgal, this is where we sort of get into the meat of everything. We see his disobedience. His disobedience. Look at verse number 8. And he tarried 7 days according to the set time that Samuel had appointed. Back in chapter 10, Samuel said, "Go to Gilgal, wait for me 7 days to sacrifice." Okay? So he tarried 7 days according to the set time that Samuel had appointed. But Samuel came not to Gilgal, and the people were scattered from him. And Saul said, "Bring hither a burnt offering to me, and peace offerings." And he offered the burnt offering. And it came to pass that as soon as he had made an end of offering the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came, and Saul went out to meet him, that he might salute him. I want to draw attention to the phrase again, according to the set time that Samuel had appointed. That we're looking back to chapter number 10. That's one of the reasons we can look back and believe that, you know what, Saul disobeyed God's direction in the first place because he was supposed to do something there and then meet Samuel in Gilgal. We don't have any of that until now here in chapter number 13. All right, and then let's look at 1 Samuel 10 one more time. It says, "And let it be when these signs are come unto thee, that thou do as occasion serve thee." So do what you find in your hand. God is with thee. "And thou shalt go down before me to Gilgal, and behold, I will come down unto thee to offer burnt offerings and to sacrifice sacrifices of peace offerings." Okay, the same offerings Saul asked for, burnt offerings and peace offerings. "7 days shalt thou tarry till I come to thee and show thee what thou shalt do." Saul was supposed to go to Gilgal, supposed to wait for 7 days, but we don't see that until here in chapter number 13. In chapter 10, the people are called to Mizpah, so Samuel can pronounce Saul as their king, but there's no mention of Saul obeying this command from Samuel to go to Gilgal. It's almost like in chapter 13, after the defeat of this garrison, that he sort of remembers what Samuel told him a little while before. And now he was going to say, "I'm going to obey this." If it is the case, if that is what happened here, that God had wanted Saul to attack the garrison of the Philistines back in chapter 10, then really we're seeing God's mercy. Saul's getting a second chance here. There was another chance for him to do this. And we're told, though, that Samuel doesn't show. Now, knowing what we do of Samuel, how he followed after God, all right, it's safe to assume that he was waiting because of a command from the Lord. God had a purpose in this. Maybe it was a way for God to test Saul to see if he would obey him this time. Okay, he had not obeyed the command to attack the garrison before. He had also told Saul to wait 7 days, and so God's saying, well, let's see if he'll wait 7 days. So Saul waits for the 7 days, all the while the people are leaving him, and so they're hiding themselves, they're crossing Jordan, they're running away, and pretty soon he doesn't have many men. In a few verses later on, we're told he's left with only 600 men, and so Saul's really feeling the pressure. The people are leaving, the Philistines are gathering this army, getting ready for battle. He didn't know what to do. And it's almost like he knew, okay, I need to look to God. I need to look to God for direction and help. So I'm going to wait for Samuel a little bit, but then he gets impatient, he gets fearful again, and he offers this sacrifice himself. And as it just so happens, as soon as he's finishing these sacrifices, Samuel shows up. A coincidence, right? Okay, I don't know exactly what happens here. All right, it says he tarried 7 days according to the time, and then he said, well, he's not here, let's do this. So we're not told specifically if he waited till the 7th day and said, he's still not here, I'm going to sacrifice, or if this was the 7 days had finished. All right? So we're not told that specifically, but I can sort of see Samuel showing up on the evening of the seventh day. And Saul could not wait till the next day. He instead said, no, we got to do this. But what amazes me is in verse 10 it says he went out to salute Samuel. Basically, he went out to greet him. He went out to bless him like nothing was wrong. It would be like somebody coming out of their house and shaking your hand, asking how things were going when there was a really big issue going on between you two. The theme that we've seen really a couple times in 1 Samuel is this theme of impatience and fear clouding judgment. Right? They impulse, they act. The nation of Israel allowed their impatience and their desire for a king to get in the way of God's perfect plan and God's perfect timing. In chapter 13, he's letting his impatience and his fear to move him to disobey God, to start trusting in his own ideas and his own plans. And when we allow impatience and fear to cloud our minds, we're going to start making unwise decisions. We're going to start deviating from what God's plan is. Okay, I'm sure all of you could point to a time in your life where you say, man, I got fearful and I stopped waiting on God. I got fearful, I stopped trusting in God. I tried to figure it out on my own and I got myself in more trouble. Okay, Saul turned to his own ideas, his own thinking of what was right, instead of waiting and following God's clear direction. I mean, if you think about it, you want, how many times do we let fear and impatience cloud our minds? We look at things like when you're younger and you say, man, I want to find a spouse. That's a good thing. But then it doesn't happen fast enough. So then we take it into our own hands and we rush into a relationship that maybe isn't God's best for us. Or we want to get ahead in life and in our finances. So instead of trusting in God's plan for us, instead of following his commands and his word, we rush ahead. We take a job that means we have to stop going to church, we have to stop serving, or we stop tithing, and we say, no, I'm going to make it into my own hands. We want a certain career, or we want our retirement to look a certain way, and so we ignore God's leading and God's direction and go after things in our own way. Okay, when we make rash decisions instead of seeking God, we're going to end up in a place that we don't want to be. And oftentimes, though, we're like Saul and we think it's all good. I didn't do anything wrong. This is not a big deal. And we don't know why things aren't going the way we expected them to, or we don't know why our relationship or job or career isn't progressing the way that we thought it would. And we're thinking everything is great. But when we look back, we see, well, I went my way instead of God's way. And we've come back to this multiple times in this series, that God's way, not yours, is the best way. It's not always easy to accept. But when we can understand that God's way is always best, then we'll be able to go forward in life in confidence, knowing he has something better for us than we could ever imagine. We need to learn to wait on God, to trust in him. We may not understand what is going on. We may say, well, my plans are better. But when we follow him and trust in him, we'll receive the blessings that he has in store for us. In Proverbs 3, we love these verses. Trust in the Lord with all thine heart, and lean not unto thine own understanding. In all thy ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct thy paths. We love to quote those, right? Those are our favorite verses, but we don't often follow them. Right? No, we want a house. We live in Vancouver. We can't do this, so I'm going to stop tithing. I'm going to stop giving so that I can save for a house. That's not God's way. You may get the house, but you got it in the wrong way. Okay? And we say, well, I trust in the Lord with my heart. This is all from God. You can't point to a blessing if you've disobeyed God. We need to acknowledge him. We need to follow after him, and he shall direct thy path. Saul was in a state of desperation here. He didn't know what to do, and he believed that his circumstances justified his disobedience to God. Okay, that example I just gave of a house in Vancouver, many people say, well, my circumstances justify my disobedience to God. I got to pay off this. I got to do that, so I don't need to tithe. That's justifying disobedience to God. It doesn't. Okay, and that's not an easy thing to sometimes take in. And I've had times where like, well, how can I twist this? How can I adjust this? How can I do this? But just because your circumstances are rough doesn't mean we stop obeying God and his commands. Saul was really leaning on his own understanding, not God's plan and God's purpose. Just because we don't understand what is going on, just because we don't know what God is doing or what God is trying to accomplish, just because we may be in a place of desperation does not mean that we can disobey God and go against his word. Okay, it is always better to obey God regardless of the outcome. might say, well, I don't know what's going to happen if I choose to tithe. God will take care of you, okay? All right? I've seen it over and over in my life. Okay? Pastors don't go into the ministry looking for money, okay? It doesn't happen. But I have seen, and not that I'm perfect in any sense of the imagination, but I've seen as I followed God, He has provided. Okay? And I've learned to be content where I am. I may never own a home, and that's okay, because I've seen God provide. I have seen God bring me to places where I may have never gotten trying to do it on my own. I tried to do things on my own, okay? And I've ended up with more debt and more things, okay? And so going our own way does not often bring us that blessing. And we say, man, I want it to look a certain way, but we need to obey God regardless of the outcome. Saul was losing his army while the enemy's army was growing. In verse 15, I mentioned this a minute ago, we're told he only had 600 men with him. In his mind, this was not a time to trust God, but it was a time to act, right? That's how our minds work. Man, I'm losing everything. This isn't working. I need to go ahead and make some action. And sometimes in life, we find ourselves in positions where everything around us seems to be falling apart. We don't see a way out or a way through whatever trial or difficulty that we're facing. Oftentimes, those situations are a result, though, of our own sin or maybe our own disobedience already to God. And then the temptation is to continue to make the wrong choices, to continue to follow our own way. But we don't need to do that. We need to instead trust in God. Okay, God is faithful. He is just. He is righteous. He knows best. And He will accomplish His plan and His purpose. You can trust Him. I don't know what God might have done if Saul had waited. I really don't. If Saul had said, you know what, I'm going to wait for Samuel, I'm going to have this sacrifice the way it's supposed to be, what would God have done? And we're going to see in our next message in chapter 14, but if you read ahead, God brings another victory, but guess what? It's not through Saul. And you might say, well, my life is great. I've got everything I think I need in life or what I want in life. But to be honest, you're never going to know what you missed out on by getting ahead of God and His plans. God's plan and God's timing, it's always in our interest. It's always the best thing for us. We might not like it in the moment. It might not be fun in the moment. But we can trust that His way is always best. And then the last aspect of this account that we're going to look at is Samuel's confrontation to Saul. It's really seen in three different parts. Samuel questions Saul, Saul gives some excuses, and then Samuel gives a final proclamation and rebuke against Saul and his line. So he starts by questioning him in verse 11. He says, and Samuel said, what hast thou done? It's really a statement of utter amazement. He's like, what in the world were you thinking, Saul? What did you do? He doesn't understand how Saul could do what he had just done. He had taken it upon himself to offer a sacrifice to the Lord instead of waiting for Samuel. He had trusted in his own understanding instead of in God. I think Saul might have thought that if I offer the sacrifice, people will stick around. That's what we're waiting for. So if I offer this, maybe they'll stop leaving. But it wasn't the case. I think they were really seeing Saul for who he truly was. From his deception about who won the battle earlier to his disobedience of God's commands, they could see his pride, his fear, his insecurity, his impatience. And I think they could see that he was not the man that they thought he was when they crowned him as king. He was a head above everybody else. He was handsome, all these things, and yet he really wasn't all that he seemed to be. But then Saul starts to give excuses. Look at verse 11. And Samuel said, what hast thou done? And Saul said, because I saw that the people were scattered from me, and that thou camest not within the days appointed, and that the Philistines gathered themselves together at Michmash. Therefore said I, the Philistines will come down now upon me to Gilgal, and I have not made supplication unto the Lord. I forced myself, therefore, and offered a burnt offering. He gives a few different excuses. First, he says, the people were scattering. I needed to keep them here. I needed to make this offering. And so he said, I got to try to keep them here by offering this sacrifice. And really, he's still seeing this upcoming battle as depending upon him and upon his leadership. He has to rally the troops. He has to inspire them. He has to lead them into battle. This is what's going to make or break the nation of Israel. And instead of seeing his army dwindling as a chance for God to do something great, he saw it as an excuse for his disobedience. I mean, he was really forgetting the history of the nation he was leading. At most, it had been a few hundred years before that time that God had worked a great deliverance through Gideon and 300 men. Okay, God is not bound by men or by what we think is best. He accomplishes his greatest work usually in our weakest moments. And Saul is sitting here going, man, all these people are leaving. I'm not going to be able to do this, instead of saying, well, God's got a reason in this. Everything is falling apart, but God's got a plan. Instead, he said, what do I do? How can I fix this? In 2 Corinthians 12, the Apostle Paul tells us about a thorn in the flesh that was given to him. And he tells how he pleaded with God 3 times to remove this thorn from him. And in verse 9, he tells us what God's answer to him was. It says, and he said unto me, my grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. God's grace, God's strength, God's power, it's greater than anything we have, and it's made perfect in our weakness. And instead of relying on God when he was weak, Saul tried to accomplish what he thought was best in his own strength. You might be in a trial right now, you might be weak right now, but you can know that God's strength is made perfect in weakness. Trust him. Don't go your own way. Don't try to go it in your own strength. Because whatever the circumstances you're facing are, they're not an excuse for your disobedience. It's only with God's strength and with his guidance that you're going to be able to get to the other side of whatever you may be going through right now. And then Saul blames Samuel. Samuel, you didn't come in time. That's why I had to disobey. And again, we're not told specifically when Samuel showed up. But Saul's saying, you were late and it's your fault, Samuel. But regardless of exactly when Samuel arrived, Saul tried to pass the blame for his sin to somebody else. And we do that all the time. Things like, I couldn't help it. Or it's because of this or that circumstance. That's why I sinned. But really, when we do that, we're really blaming God. God, you allowed a hard time in my life. That's why I sinned against you. God, because my circumstances changed, you allowed that. That's why I turned away from you and stopped following after you. This was a difficult time, and so it was your fault. And so I'm going to turn away from you. But really, the blame game that we see going on here with Saul, it goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden. Adam blamed Eve. Eve blamed the serpent. That's what we do. But what we need to realize is we're responsible for our own sin. Don't try to blame God. Don't try to blame others. Instead, repent and turn to God for forgiveness. Saul didn't seek forgiveness. He instead sought to blame somebody else for his disobedience. And it really ties into the last excuse. He says, the Philistines are gathering. I'm fearing they're going to come and attack me before I have a chance to offer sacrifice. Hint, hint, Samuel, you were late. Okay? And he says, I forced myself to offer the sacrifice. It was my only choice, Samuel. I had no other option. I didn't want to go to battle without having offered a sacrifice to the Lord, so I disobeyed him and offered the sacrifice myself. Okay, it seems pretty silly when you put it that way, and yet so many Christians, we do that. Well, I couldn't see a way past this, and so I disobeyed God instead of obeying God. And now I want God to bless me. Okay? Samuel said, I didn't have another choice. I didn't have any choice, so I'm going to disobey him and do something that I'm hoping will get his blessing. No matter what the situation, I can tell you this for sure, God doesn't want us to disobey him. If we find ourselves in a place where there seems to be only 2 options and both of them are bad, we're not looking hard enough, okay? 1 Corinthians 10:13 says, there is no temptation taken you, but such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that ye are able, but will with the temptation also make a way to escape, that ye may be able to bear it. I love about this verse, it tells us that every temptation we face is common to man. Okay, basically, when you feel like you're the only one facing a temptation, there's other people too. All right, this is something that's not new to you. It's not something God didn't think about. Others are going through this as well. But the best part is that with the temptation, he will also make a way to escape, that ye may be able to bear it. There is always a way out of sin. We're just not usually looking hard enough. Okay? Or we don't want to do it. All right? If you are watching TV and something bad comes on, guess what the solution is? Turn it off. There's a button on your remote that says off. Okay? Or a button that says change channel. All right? There's always a solution to what we're going through. God has given us. He's faithful. He's not going to give us more than we can handle. He's there with us. He's going to provide a way of escape. Yet we're often not looking for it. God's given you a way out of whatever situation or circumstance you might be in. Doesn't mean the way out is easy. Usually it takes effort and a lot of trust and a lot of dependence on God, but it is there. And really, 1 Corinthians 10:13 tells us that there's never an excuse for sin. And it's not an easy thing to hear, to be honest. I didn't like writing it in my message because when I write it and I say it, I have to sort of apply it too, okay? I have to say, oh yeah, there's never an excuse for sin in my life too. But God gives us a way of escape. God's strength is made perfect in our weakness. We just have to be willing to turn to Him for the strength and the help that we need. Whether that's a sin that you're struggling with, whether that's just a trial or a difficulty you're going through, we need to turn to Him for the help that we need. But the last part of this confrontation is Samuel's rebuke of Saul. Verse 13, and Samuel said to Saul, thou hast done foolishly. Thou hast not kept the commandment of the Lord thy God, which He commanded thee. For now would the Lord have established thy kingdom upon Israel forever. Basically, he states the obvious, Saul, you're being dumb. You've disobeyed God. You've not kept His commandments, and now God's judgment is upon you. And it seems like a harsh judgment, but he'd really taken upon himself the office of the priest and offered up an offering to God. Now, we see this later on. We'll see David offering up sacrifices to God and not being punished like Saul was. But there's a difference. David was obeying a commandment of a prophet named Gad. But Samuel tells Saul, the difference is here, thou hast not kept the commandment of the Lord thy God. And once again, we see Saul's pride in play. He thought he knew what was best, so he went ahead and did it, regardless of what God had commanded him to do. And from what Samuel says, God was willing to give Saul a chance. He says, for now would the Lord have established thy kingdom thy kingdom upon Israel forever. If you had obeyed God, if you had followed Him, it seems to indicate that His kingdom would have been established forever. But because of his disobedience, Samuel rebukes him and pronounces judgment upon him in verse 14. But now thy kingdom shall not continue. The Lord hath sought him a man after His own heart, and the Lord hath commanded him to be captain over His people, because thou hast not kept that which the Lord commanded thee. Back in chapter 12, in Samuel's final address, Samuel said, if ye will fear the Lord, and serve Him, and obey His voice, and not rebel against the commandment of the Lord, then shall both ye and also the king that reigneth over you continue following the Lord your God. But if ye will not obey the voice of the Lord, but rebel against the commandments of the Lord, then shall the hand of the Lord be against you, as it was against your fathers. The warning had been given back in chapter 12. Obey God and you'll do well, but if you disobey God, there will be judgment. And this judgment upon Saul, that God was going to take the kingdom away from him and his family and to give it to a man of his own heart, was really a just and righteous judgment. And really, we can learn from Saul that it's always foolish to disobey God. Okay, and I'm going to say it again. There's no situation, there's no circumstance, no excuse that makes disobedience to God acceptable in the life of a Christian. I know it's not easy to hear. I'm not getting a lot of amens tonight. That's okay. All right? But that is the truth. As a Christian, we are to be following after God. We are to be striving to live for Him, to obey Him. And so there's really nothing that comes into life that allows us to say, I have an excuse to disobey God. Okay, I don't know if you guys do this. We do this at our home where we're saying, it's been a long day. It's been a stressful day. Let's eat junk food. Okay, let's get a burger, right? It's great. Grace is clapping, all right? We say, oh man, it's been a tough day. Let's go out and get something greasy, okay? All right, and yeah, you can tell, all right? That's why, okay? All right? It's not that way in the Christian life, all right? I can't be like, you know what, I've had a very stressful year, so now I get to go out and disobey God. Okay? My finances are tough, so now I get to go out and disobey God. This bad thing happened in my life, so now I can go out and disobey God. That's not how it works, all right? We are to be obeying Him, to be following Him. So there's really nothing that can come into our lives where we can say, you know what, this is making it acceptable for me to disobey God. Sin always has consequences, and while we may see God's grace in those consequences, they are always there. Saul let his fear and his impatience on God to cause him to disobey God's clear command, and because of that, he lost the kingdom that God had given to him. God's given us so much as Christians, and I don't want to lose it because I've decided I'm just going to go ahead and disobey Him. After Samuel's rebuke of Saul, we're told in verse 15, and Samuel arose and gat him up from Gilgal unto Gibeah of Benjamin. And Saul numbered the people that were present with him, about 600 men. And Saul and Jonathan his son and the people that were present with them abode in Gibeah of Benjamin. but the Philistines encamped in Michmash. So Samuel leaves Saul. Saul only has 600 men left. I don't know if more men left after Samuel's rebuke, but we just know that Saul really did not have an army left. They go to Gibeah while the Philistines are in Michmash, and the rest of the chapter really sets up what's going to happen in chapter number 14. The Philistines send groups of soldiers into 3 different directions. We're not told their purpose, but they're called spoilers. So they go out from this camp in Michmash. And in the last few verses, we're given the condition of the nation. We're told that there was no smith found in all of Israel. There were no swords or weapons found except with Saul and Jonathan. We're told that the Israelites had to go to the Philistines to get their farming tools sharpened. It seems like this incident made the Philistines sort of crack down on things. They said, no, we're not going to let them have, we're not going to let them have any kind of weapons. We're not going to let them do their own sharpening of things. The Philistines were really in complete control. And in the last verse of chapter 13, it sets the scene for chapter 14. It says, and the garrison of the Philistines went out to the passage of Michmash. And we're going to look at chapter 14 next time we come back to this series. But chapter 13 of 1 Samuel, it marks the beginning of the end for Saul and his reign and his kingship. And really, again, his line is no longer going to rule over Israel. But according to that verse that we read where Samuel says, for now would the Lord have established thy kingdom upon Israel forever, it seems like it could have all been avoided if Saul would have just obeyed God. And really the lesson that we can learn in this chapter, it boils down to this: obedience to God is always best. That's what it comes down to. Saul had allowed pride in his position to get in the way of his obedience to God. He didn't obey God in chapter 10 when he was first told to go to the garrison of the Philistines. His son is the one who eventually makes the attack and obeys God. Saul was really more worried about the people and what they thought about what they were doing than he was about obeying God. And we need to be careful we don't fall into the same trap. Obedience to God is always best. It doesn't matter what so-and-so thinks. It doesn't matter what your workmates think. It doesn't matter. Okay, what matters is, what does God think? What does God have to say? And sometimes that obedience to God requires patience on our part. Don't let your impatience or your fear or your insecurities cause you to disobey God. That's really what happened with Saul. He was fearful. The people were leaving. I don't think he was very secure in his position as the king. And he was impatient. He said, no, we got to get this done now. And it may sound harsh. I've said it multiple times tonight, but it doesn't matter what you're going through in life. It does not excuse disobedience to God. I'm not going to say that you're going to go through life and everything's going to be fine. You will have hard times. Many of you have been through very difficult times. But it doesn't excuse disobedience to God. You may not understand what's going on. You may not see God's plan in what's happening. You might say, I don't know how to deal with this situation, but it doesn't mean we then go and disobey God, that we stop following Him, that we stop walking with Him. That's when we need to turn to God and lean on Him for His strength. That's when we need to turn to God and trust in Him and say, God, I don't know what's going on, but I'm going to do my best to trust in You. That's when you find people who can lift you up and encourage you instead of say, oh yeah, God's not got your back on this. Don't find the people who are going to say, yeah, you're miserable, I'm going to help you be more miserable, and I'm going to pull you away from God. Find those who will say, and yes, it may sound cliche, where they say, you know what, we don't know what God's doing, but He's in control. But one who will pray with you, one who will walk alongside you, those are the people you need during those times. Don't say, well, you know what, it's been hard, and I'm going to blame God for this, and I'm going to just go and do my own thing. We're not going to be perfect in it. Okay, but when we sin, when we acknowledge that we sin, we can seek God's forgiveness and then move forward striving to obey Him. But too often we don't want to wait on God. We want everything in our timing, on our timetable. And we try to rush God. And then when we finally give in to Him and His timing, when we give whatever it is over to Him, that's when we see Him start to work. When we're finally content with where He has placed us, or with the circumstance or the trial that He has allowed, then we see Him do something amazing. When we stop trying to figure it out, I'm going to figure out how I'm going to make more money. I'm going to figure out how I'm going to do this. I'm going to figure out how I'm going to do all these things that I want in life. When we finally say, you know what, Lord, I'm going to work hard. I'm not going to just sit around. I'm going to work hard, but I'm going to be content with where You've placed me, and I'm going to do my best in that place where You've placed me. Then we see God start to move. It is when we learn to submit to God and His plan and His timing that we will see Him work. But we also learn in this chapter that disobedience has consequences. This is something that Alyssa and I have been trying to teach our kids as they've been growing. We want them to learn this because we want them to learn to obey God, and because I don't want them to have to face the consequences of their sin because they disobeyed God. I'd rather them learn to obey God and avoid those consequences than to go and sin and see the consequences and go and sin and see the consequences. Okay, this is what I told the teens when I was the youth pastor, and I tell them sometimes too. We tell you don't do stuff because we did stuff and we figured out it wasn't good. Okay? Your parents, the same thing. Okay? When parents say don't do that, a lot of times they say, I did that and it didn't turn out well. There were consequences that I don't want you to face. And something we're trying to teach our kids is that, you know what? Sin has consequences. Disobedience has consequences. And I'm pretty sure I've told them, if you don't want the consequence, then obey. It's the same thing with God. God says, if you follow me, there's not the consequences for sin. If you follow me, you will see my blessing in your life. If you follow me, then yes, not everything is going to always be perfect as you follow me, but you're going to be obeying, you're going to be listening, you're not going to see those consequences because you purposely went away from me. God has given us a way of escape in every situation that we find ourselves in, but are you looking for it? Saul's reign really had barely started in chapter 13, and yet it's already the beginning of the end, and he reigns for quite a long time after this. But this is the start of the end. God says it's going to be taken away from you. And I don't know where you are tonight, what you might be struggling with, but can I challenge you that when you choose to disobey God, when you choose to go your own way, you're at the beginning of the end. You're going downhill. Yes, you can turn and you can seek God's forgiveness, you can repent, you can come back to Him. But if you keep going the way you're going, you're just going to keep going down, 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 down. In Galatians chapter 6, and we're going to get there in a little while in our study, Paul says, "Be not deceived, God is not mocked, for whatsoever man soweth, that shall he also reap." When you sow disobedience to God, you will reap His judgment. When you sow obedience to God, you'll reap His favor. So my challenge to you tonight is to obey God in every area of your life, regardless of the outcome. You might say, well, if I obey God in this, am I going to have enough money to provide? God will help you. Usually, those questions of budget, I'll tell you, it's not if I give to God, I won't have enough. You might just have to cut something else that you like. Okay, that's a side note, all right? But oftentimes it's this or that. I can't obey God because if I obey God, then this will happen. That's not the case. Obey God in every area of your life, regardless of the outcome. It might be scary. You might not know what's going to happen, but I can guarantee you that obedience to God is always best. Let's have every head bowed and every eye closed